Good evening from New York. At a meeting with Palestinian leaders in June 2003, then President Bush reportedly having claimed that God told him to go to war. Mr. Bush reported as having said, quote, "God would tell me, George, go and fight those terrorists in Afghanistan, and I did. And then God would tell me, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq, and I did." Our fifth story on the countdown, it turns out that God received a rather hefty assist from Donald Rumsfeld. Newly released memos showing that Mr. Bush's defense secretary, having placed on the cover of his daily reports to the president biblical passages and corresponding war imagery that carefully framed the mission in Iraq as nothing less than a Christian crusade, what another faith might call a jihad. Mr. Rumsfeld apparently having left nothing to chance, not only often having hand-delivered to the White House his daily top-secret briefings for President Bush, but also having spiffed them up with the cover pages that matched photos from the previous days' war efforts with scripture from the Bible. Among the examples, March 17th, 2003, 2 days before the invasion, servicemen praying, their heads bowed before their rifles, quote, "Whom shall I send and who will go for us? Here I am, Lord, send me." Isaiah 6, verse 8. April 7th, 2003, as U.S. forces launched their assault on Baghdad. A screen grab of Saddam Hussein on Iraqi TV, quote, "It is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men." 1 Peter 2, verse 15. April 8th, 2003, 1 day before the fall of Iraq's capital city, an American tank passing beneath Baghdad's Hands Victory Monument in what is now part of the U.S. enclave called the Green Zone. Quote, "Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the nation that keeps faith." Isaiah 26, verse 2. GQ's Robert Draper reporting that at least one Muslim analyst at the Pentagon having been greatly offended by the cover pages, others having been privately concerned about what the fallout might have been if those images had been leaked during a war against an Islamic nation. When some actually took the trouble to complain, no small thing in the Bush administration, they were told that the practice would continue because Rumsfeld, President Bush, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Richard Myers, all appreciated the cover pages. GQ also reporting that the cover pages were not Secretary Rumsfeld's direct invention. Instead, they were the brainchild of the Pentagon's Director of Intelligence, Major General Glenn Schaffer. Nor were they even the Defense Secretary's style, Mr. Rumsfeld not being one to flaunt his own religious views. It was, however, President Bush's style. Mr. Rumsfeld, writes Draper, likely having viewed the scripture as a way to make a personal connection with his president. Time now to call on our own political analyst, Richard Wolff. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
I've seen a lot of interpretation of this as proselytizing, as I used that term earlier about kind of combining in an unacceptable fashion religion and government. But it's actually a little more cynical than that, isn't it? I mean, whatever you think of Bush's faith or its relevance to governance or war, wasn't Rumsfeld basically exploiting it?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to salute Robert Draper and GQ magazine because they've really filled a very important piece that's been missing in the puzzle all along. Why invade Iraq? Why stick with a war that was going disastrously wrong? Religious faith and this cynical, manipulative appeal to religious faith is clearly a big part of it. And yes, it's exploitative. We knew at the time, those of us covering the White House, that one of the tactics Rumsfeld used to use was to portray his policy proposals to the president as being bold, on the idea that anything that was bold the president would sign up to. Well, here we have something frankly more shocking and troubling, this idea that there was this religious infusion. Now, we know Rumsfeld didn't feel it, but he was clearly exploiting the faith aspect of this president. And one thing to remind ourselves, though, the president had the opportunity to say no to any of this, and he wasn't just being manipulated by Rumsfeld. He was also being manipulated by Cheney, who, of course, was the one-time protege and then mentor of Don Rumsfeld.
But this wasn't. Do we think these cover letters had a practical impact on this, on the war, on the conduct, on the policy? I mean, Mr. Bush could not have thought that those cover letters themselves were the work of God. I mean, he had to have known they were the hand of Rumsfeld, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But there is a subtle sort of gray area about a president who sees himself or saw himself as an instrument of God's will and being willingly, I think, manipulated here along these lines. Remember that there was an essential leap of faith here, not just about the intelligence, but the purpose of the war, the reason for sticking with it. And the president was kind of explicit about this. He said his faith was his comfort that led him to stick with the war and with the troops when everyone else said things were going so horribly wrong. So I don't think this is a minor thing, but yeah, he didn't think that this was God's hand, but he thought he was operating on some sort of divine mission.
And amazingly, the cover pages may not be the worst of what is contained within the GQ article. Secretary Rumsfeld, we have now learned in this article, held up the deployment of active duty forces to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, including the entire fleet of the search and rescue helicopters, because he didn't believe in using active duty military personnel on principle. It's almost too bad these are in the same article, because that's not going to get the attention it deserves, is it?
No, it's not, although he was not the only person who was tied up in this stupid legalese and allegedly principle. Really, none of them wanted to respond until it was too late. Blame Rumsfeld all you like, but there was a collective failure there, and that goes all the way to the top of that old administration.
Last point, quickly, are we worried still about the reaction in the Arab world about those cover pages even now?
Absolutely. You know, you think that the debate last week about those photos, the Obama administration said they didn't want to release. They were worried about the reaction. This is way more damaging than another round of photos, because it casts doubt on the mission, because there are troops in the field right now who are going to have their motives questioned because of this.
MSNBC political analyst Richard Wolff, as always, thank you for your insight, sir. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Keith.